Well, a very happy and early new year to you. I don't know how many of you know this, but there has been a crime wave that's been sweeping the country during the last several Christmases. It's a copycat crime, the same one being committed over and over and over and over. And it involves baby Jesus of all things. In fact, you can just Google baby Jesus stolen, and you'll see news story after news story about churches' nativity scenes or even people's nativity scenes in their front yards having baby Jesus stolen right out of the manger, leaving all the other characters looking at nothing but the straw. And it's kind of funny in one sense, if you think of everyone singing a song like Away in a Manger, while literally baby Jesus is literally away from the manger. Most of these thefts are just pranks, and they're usually not pulled off by people who are firing on all cylinders exactly. There are the 5 girls in the college sorority who stole baby Jesus out of a manger scene on the town square and then dumped him on the front lawn of their university's president. They wound up being arrested. Turns out when they came clean, they confessed to having come up with the idea in a bar late one night. That's a big surprise, right? Then there's the woman in Virginia who stole an 80-pound statue of baby Jesus. And her mistake, of course, was bragging about it on Facebook and posting a picture. And then there are some people who steal Jesus from the nativity scenes because, quite frankly, they're angry with the church or with religion, having been perhaps hurt by the church or religion in their past. This is where some commercial and home security companies, though, are getting in on the action. They are now encouraging people to install GPS trackers on their baby Jesuses in their outdoor nativity scenes. And I think about this, and it makes me think of LoJack. How many of you remember LoJack? I didn't say Kojak, for those of you my age and older, the television detective. I said LoJack. LoJack was a device that you could put on your vehicle that helped you track it in the event that it was hijacked or stolen, a very popular device years ago. Well, today, with these GPS trackers, you can now LoJack baby Jesus. And with a GPS tracker inserted into him, a church or a homeowner could literally track with their smartphone the whereabouts of Jesus if he ever got away from the manger. And there are some people that are actually doing this. And I say all that to say, you know what, nobody likes to have things that are stolen, but this idea of tracking Jesus, of LoJacking Jesus, intrigues me. People who want to locate him, protect him, manage him, keep him safe in a certain spot, having and maintaining control of him. More about that in a second. The truth is, folks have been trying to steal Jesus since that very first Christmas. There were very real people who wanted to steal the real baby Jesus after he was born. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke reveal that while news of his birth brought great joy to many, it was also a threat to others. Herod was so threatened by the news of the birth of a king of the Jews that he ordered the deaths of every boy 2 years of age and under in the town of Bethlehem. From Herod's perspective, baby Jesus was dangerous. And even the priest Simeon came up to Joseph and Mary when Joseph and Mary brought Jesus to the temple at 8 days of age and dedicated him at the temple. An old priest by the name of Simeon there in Jerusalem spoke these words over Jesus to Joseph and Mary. He said, "This child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be spoken against, so that the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed." Luke 2:34 and 35. And he was right. Jesus would grow up to be a threat to many people and to many things For one, he would be a threat to the status quo. He'd say radical things about loving our enemies and forgiveness and generosity and power and greed and ambition and lust and anger and pride. He'd live in radical ways as a servant, a sufferer, a sacrifice. And he'd spend a great deal of his time eating and associating with those who were outside the ropes in society. The sick and the poor, the outcasts, the tax collectors, the prostitutes. And if he rebuked anyone, it was often the religious leaders and the insiders. And would all lead to the climax of his life, where he would take on the two biggest bullies he would ever take on, sin and death. And even after he died, what's interesting is that there was still some concern with Jesus being stolen. Pilate made his tomb property of the Roman government and put guards around it to deter anyone from even thinking about stealing the body of Jesus. As far as Pilate was concerned, and even the religious leaders, Jesus was still a threat, or at least even the idea of Jesus being still alive was a threat and was dangerous. And so they were doing everything they could to keep anyone from attempting to steal his body. But they couldn't keep one from stealing his body. And this one wasn't afraid of Rome. And the truth is, he wasn't even stealing Jesus because Jesus belongs to him. It was his Father who declared him to be his Son through his resurrection from the dead. And the rest is history. So back to this idea, though, of hijacking and lowjacking and tracking Jesus. Most of us would probably never mess with a nativity scene. But that's not to say that we wouldn't try to manage Jesus and move him around. I've had my times where I've wanted to locate him, even confine him, make him stay put, so to speak. I've lived through seasons in my life, and I have proclaimed him in places like a worship service, but pretty much ignored him through how I was living my life the rest of the week. I've had my moments where I was eager to look to him as an emergency flotation device while I was drowning, but I was rather reluctant to look to him as the captain of my ship that I was sailing on through life. I'd look to him to save my soul, so to speak. But when it came to living my life in the real world, I wasn't up for allowing him to have much of a say in that. It's a different way of hijacking Jesus, where we reshape Jesus to fit our life instead of us being reshaped in the image of his life and will. And today we live in a world where churches and people are still concerned with Jesus being stolen from nativity scenes. And even people are being concerned with Jesus being stolen from Christmas and the Christ being taken out of Christmas. But here's what I want to ask. What if those who claim him actually went a step further and allowed him to run loose in their lives? What if just those who claimed him had a relationship with him that went away from the manger? You see, he was born in Bethlehem. In fact, the city of Bethlehem, the name Bethlehem means house of bread. Jesus did once refer to himself as the bread of life. One of the curious things about Herod and how he responded to the birth of Jesus is that he didn't want the bread of life to rise, not in his region. That's why Herod brought bloodshed in the house of bread, because he was resistant to the bread of life rising. And yet I would ask you on this last Sunday, as we enter into a new year and even a new decade, what if you and I allowed Jesus to rise like never before in our lives? You see, I think one of the things that keeps us from allowing him to rise like never before in our lives is deep down inside, we are not so convinced that allowing him to rise and rule in new ways in our lives will really bring us life. But he's the bread of life. And his government, his rulership, according to Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 6, will bring peace. So what if we decided to let him run loose in our lives. After all, in 1 John 3 and verse 8, John says the reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the devil's work. And ultimately, this is who Jesus is really a threat to: Satan. In fact, when the book of Revelation tells the Christmas story in Revelation chapter 12, it tells it from heaven's perspective, and it speaks of a dragon pursuing a woman and a child and almost overtaking them, only to have the woman and the child delivered at the last second. And so the dragon goes off to make war on the child's offspring. By the way, that would be you and me. But Revelation ends with the dragon being slayed. And wouldn't you know it, that baby Jesus turns out to be the original dragon slayer. You see, the truth is, Jesus doesn't need to be protected or guarded or tracked or defended. He came to be followed. And as we follow him, the work of the dragon is slayed, not just in our lives, but in the lives of people in the world around us. And Jesus has come to destroy the work of the dragon in all of our lives, in the lives of people who hatch drunken plots in bars. He's come to destroy the work of the dragon in the lives of people who are making terrible decisions while clamoring for attention and affection. He's come to wreak havoc on the work of the dragon in the lives of people who are being eaten alive by their bitterness and their rage, by people who are being eaten alive by their anger with the world or even their anger with God. Jesus has come to deliver us and slay the dragon and his work in the lives of all of us. It's not Jesus that needs saving. We're the ones that do. He's not the one that really gets hijacked. The truth is, we are. He's not the one who's lost. We are. And if there's any tracking of Jesus to be done, it's not to manage him, it's to follow him. And that's why, hopefully, you see what we're about to enter into here in a couple of weeks, beginning to January 6th, is so important. This little book, In the Red, that hopefully you had a chance to pick up at the end of one of our Christmas Eve candlelight services. And if you weren't there, you can snag one in the lobby today. It's one per person. It's in the spirit of this that we're just kicking this off and offering this as a resource, a way to follow Jesus, to track him Monday through Fridays in the month of January, just to have a little bit of time to spend with Jesus in the middle of his words, reflecting on them and seeking to align our lives with them. And I encourage you to pick one of these up, because Jesus, he doesn't necessarily need to be saved or tracked or managed because he can be stolen. Jesus has come to be followed. If you haven't picked up your copy yet, snag one on your way out. It's but one way we're seeking to follow him beyond the manger as we enter into a new year and even into a new decade. But for now, I want to leave you with one more picture. I want you to take a look at this picture. It may not look like much to you. It's a picture of the front of what's known as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. I had an opportunity to visit it a few years ago. It was built many centuries ago in the spot where it was thought that Jesus' tomb was and where his resurrection took place. What you're looking at is a simple wooden ladder at the base of a window at the front of that church. It looks like a worker left it there, maybe a painter or a window washer, a few weeks ago. But the fact is, that ladder has been in that exact spot for more than 200 years. It hasn't moved. And here's why. There are 5 different Christian groups that lay claim to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And for the last few hundred years, these 5 Christian groups have fought among themselves as to who is the rightful owner and administrator of this church. Things have been so contentious in recent decades that they've agreed to allow the family who represents another religion to actually have the keys to the church. They've asked a Muslim family to have the keys to the church. And every day, this Muslim family opens and closes the Church of the Holy Sepulchre there in Jerusalem. But what about the ladder? Well, some 200 years ago, these Christian groups were in a contentious season over how things were being done at their church. So they made an agreement that today the locals there call the doctrine of the status quo. And it says this, that no one can make a change to the church of the Holy Sepulchre without the consent of all five families. You can't even touch the ladder. So it's remained there in the same position for more than 2 centuries. And this ladder, in some ways, reflects two of some of the sadder and greater ironies I know of in Christianity today. One is that there are 5 Christian groups who are so contentious with one another and trusted each other so little that they've all agreed that it's best that a Muslim family have the keys to the church, which marks the spot of Jesus' resurrection. That's not much of a witness to the power of unity and reconciliation in Jesus' name, is it? And the other irony is the whole idea of the doctrine of the status quo being found at the place that marks the tomb of Jesus. What an irony. To agree that nothing moves and everything remains the same on top of what is thought to be potentially the spot where the resurrection of Jesus happened. And all along, the whole reason Jesus came and did what he did was to make it possible for all of us to make a move and not remain the same. And yet, at one traditional site where it's thought he's risen, not much has changed for a few hundred years. And the question I want to ask you as we go into 2020, in light of what I've shared today, is this: what's the ladder that finally needs to be moved in your life in 2020? How will you follow him beyond the manger? How will you follow him beyond the status quo? What is it about your life that things have come together in such a way as just to continually support and even defend the status quo that Jesus of all things will challenge in his words and in his life? Because he's come that we might have life and life to the full. He's come that it might be possible to make a real change. So I would ask you as we take communion together, what status quo in your life do you want to rise above? Do you want to transcend as a follower of Jesus in 2020? Because he's come that you might make a move. I would invite those serving communion to be going to their places. And I would invite you to pray with me. Lord, on our last Sunday together, a Sunday that wraps up not just a year, but this decade, on this last Sunday together, we put ourselves before you and we ask for grace to be upon us as we ponder these next couple of days what kind of move we'll make. We give you thanks that you're calling us beyond the status quo. We give you thanks that you've come to lead us beyond the manger. And we ask for your power, Lord, the power that transforms not just our bodies, but a power that transforms our will, Lord. That the status quo might be shattered in areas where it needs to be shattered. In our lives vocationally, in our families, in our friendships, in our marriages, in our walk with you, in our relationship with our resources, and how we've processed the pain of our past, wherever it is that the status quo is being lived by, and yet wherever it is that the doctrine of the status quo needs to be shattered because of what you've come to bring. Lord, we pray it's shattered in Jesus' name, and that we'll see more clearly and live more fully in 2020 through Christ. Amen.